All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Module 3, Legal Foundations of Homeland Security. If you remember, legal foundations provide the basis for what kind of policies, what kind of procedures, what kind of things the government can do, in furtherance of this all hazards approach to Homeland Security. So we'll back up just a little bit. So during the 60s and 70s, internationally, terrorism really started to get some attention. And international community started enacting some treaties, um, and other domestic policies were enacted to counteract terrorism. So there are two phases. International laws and treaties were enacted to address these worldwide, terror threats and state sponsorship of terror, and then criminal and administrative laws were enacted to change and enhance domestic security. So that happened during the 60s and 70s, and then again, after the 9/11 attacks, in the wake of those attacks, this whole process kind of repeated itself to where there were treaties enacted, and this variety of domestic policies kind of went through a whole other phase of that again in the early 2000s. So there's some challenges, of course, when you talk about international and domestic law and policy, right? There's some challenges there. Um, so when you're talking about international and domestic counterterrorist laws, right, you're creating policy, um, but it also creates political questions and it creates challenges. So in the U.S., when they create domestic policies, they should reflect the legal parameters that are established under the law, as well as these international and domestic security environments. So they got to not only take into account these environments, but also the legal parameters that are established under law. So first, let's talk about international law. International law is based on more tradition, custom, and formal agreements between nations. And these are much more cooperative because there's no international enforcement mechanism. Like there's no agency that enforces these agreements, right? Which is why we have all the problems that we have with other countries, not just about terrorism, but just about anything, right? Everybody signs these things, but it's cooperative, right? Yeah, we'll do that, sure. And then, maybe we won't, right? There's no way to make them do it. Because these nations, that they're voluntarily recognizing the authority of these agreements. So when they voluntarily decide not to recognize them, then you could have some problem. Um, International legal authority, is then recognized through these formal agreements. It could be bilateral, which is between two nations, or multilateral, which is multiple nations. All right, so domestic law, obviously the challenge here is going to always be balancing security with constitutional rights, right? What is allowed under the law that we can use to provide security. In extreme circumstances, sometimes authoritative laws are passed, and they're always justified by arguing that the suspension of civil liberties is necessary for the greater good. All right, so historical context, let's talk about state sponsorship of international terrorism. Okay, so why do we have international terrorism? International terrorism is used to focus the world's attention on some domestic conflict. Okay, so international terrorism is a domestic conflict that spills over onto the international stage. Okay, so this domestic conflict, throws itself out there, internationally, and they pick these symbolic targets because it has some kind of international value. For example, 9/11, they picked the World Trade Center, right? Because that had international value, that international symbolic value, more than just the United States. Um, they also use international terrorism because low-cost operations can get this worldwide exposure, especially now when you have this 24-hour news cycle and all this online news, and people can get news all the time, right? So you can do something pretty low cost and get worldwide exposure and get it for days. Um, Hijackings, bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, extortion, other kinds of criminal acts. Um, those things are much more effective when you get international attention, right? If you're not, if it's not just here in your one little country, right? It's around the world. That stuff's much more effective. Okay, so you have these domestic conflicts, that spill over international terrorism. But you also have state sponsorship of international terrorism. Okay, so some governments use terrorism as a policy option. Okay, if they can't employ, you know, conventional armed forces to achieve their strategic objectives, they may use terrorism instead. So if you have a government that cannot really feasibly directly confront an adversary, terrorism then becomes a practical option. Okay, so you can end up with these, sometimes it's state sponsored, but other times the state sponsors a group. Okay, so if you have terrorists that need resources for their cause, they can find willing partners with these governments that want worldwide exposure. Um, so because of this, the international community had to come up with some kind of legal framework to respond to the states. So what the U.S. did is they designate some governments as state sponsors of terror, and then movements as foreign terrorist organizations. So countries and governments could be classified as state sponsors of terror if they support or provide resources for terrorist groups, and then the groups themselves can be classified as foreign terrorist organizations. All right, so classifying state sponsors. So the U.S. Department of State publishes the country reports on terrorism. You can find them online right now if you want. And they identify state sponsors of terrorism or governments that support terrorist activity. They also identify foreign terrorist organizations, which are usually insurgent terrorist groups. So they use these lists to frame U.S. policy, both foreign and domestic, and create a legal foundation for responding to terrorist incidents and allegations of state sponsors of terror. Right? It's much easier to respond to these things and make your argument that something needs to be done if this group or government or whoever is already on one of these lists. So to be designated as a state sponsor of terror, the state must have repeatedly provided support for international acts of terror. Okay, so the list is fluid and dynamic. Countries are added, countries are removed. But once you're added to it, then sanctions can be applied to you. Okay, so there's things like a ban on arms-related exports and sales. There's controls over exports of items that could be used to enhance a country's military capability or could be used to support terror. There's prohibitions placed on what kind of economic assistance you can receive. And there's other financial restrictions and other types of restrictions that can be applied as far as sanctions if you're a state sponsor of terror. Currently, there's 4. Now, this is going to look a little different. The textbook references the 2017 list. This list is a little bit different. But right now, we got Iran, Syria, Cuba, and North Korea listed as state sponsors of terror. All right, so foreign terrorist organizations now. To be listed as a foreign terrorist organization, you must meet some criteria. So first of all, it must be a foreign organization. All right. They also have to engage in terrorist activity as defined by statute, which is interesting because there's a lot of different definitions of terrorism that we actually talk about in CRIM 441 and why that's a problem. But terrorist activity is defined by statute or retain the capability and intent to engage in terrorist activity or terrorism. Another problem, how do you gauge intent? Like, what is someone's intent to engage in terrorist activity? This is where things get kind of cloudy sometimes. Okay, this is where you end up with these kind of disagreements about who's a foreign terrorist organization and who's not, right? Who's a freedom fighter? Who's a terrorist, right? Depends on definitions. But they also want to gauge intent, which is something that's very, very, very hard to do. So the activity or terrorism that they take part in must threaten the security of U.S. nationals or the national security of the United States. So there's a current list of foreign terrorist organizations, and I provide that for you in the PowerPoint. All right, so international law now. So we talked about how it's a cooperative agreement. So there's international law and counterterrorist cooperation within this world community, right? So you have international conventions. And those are multinational agreements between countries which state that specific protocols and procedures will be respected among the people that are there, okay? So whoever signs this thing, they all agree to these protocols and procedures between each other. So if you look at the different conventions, they usually reflect the issues of the period. So in the 70s, the conventions were things focused on like hijackings. In the 80s, they prohibited attacks on civilian passenger ships, civilian airports. And in the 90s, they prohibit funding of terrorist groups, mass casualty bombings. Okay, so if you look at what the conventions focus on in each decade, it'll tell you the kind of things that were going on, international at least, during this time. So part of these agreements is also an agreement to extradite or prosecute terrorist perpetrators. So if somebody does something in America and we've got an agreement signed with, I'll say Germany, and those people flee to Germany, then Germany is supposed to extradite them back to the United States. A lot of times these conventions focus more on criminal behavior than actual terrorism. And one of the reasons for that is because criminal behavior is much easier to define, right? I mentioned a couple minutes ago about terrorism has these varying definitions and like perspective on who is what, but if you talk about criminal behavior, that's much more clearly defined. All right, so if the U.S. signs on these conventions, it doesn't actually have any legal status with the United States until Congress passes legislation giving it legal status. If you look at Table 3.1 in the book, it lists the different conventions. All right, so there's international conventions to protect diplomats. I'm not going to go through all of these, but know these. Know the different conventions. Know what they did. Okay, so you have international conventions that protect diplomats, international conventions on hijacking offenses. We talk about international conventions concerning extradition. Okay, so extradition treaties require governments to hold and hand over terrorist suspects. Okay, it can be really powerful and effective if used, but what if they don't? Okay, again, you're talking about collaborative things, right? So there's little recourse if somebody decides not to comply. Okay, the only recourse is going to try to get them to and try to use, I guess, sanctions or whatever you have at your disposal to try to get them to do that. So all these people can sign on to this stuff like, yeah, it's great. Yeah, we'll extradite. We'll do all these things. But then, oh, wait, no, we don't want to. There's really very little that can be done. All right. In order to address problems of terrorism, genocide, torture, international crime, the United Nations established international courts and tribunals. Now, make sure you know these as well. So you have the International Court of Justice, and this is the principal judicial arm of the United Nations. Okay, they have 15 judges that serve 9-year terms, and they hear disputes between nations. You have International Criminal Court, which was established to prosecute crimes against humanity and designed to promote human rights and justice. You have the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It investigated war crimes and genocide as a result of the civil war in Yugoslavia in the 90s. Then they have the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which investigated war crimes and genocide that resulted in the civil war in Rwanda in the 90s. All right, so legal foundations of Homeland Security. Let's talk about some statutes. Okay, so Congress enacted new counterterrorism legislation in 96 and 2001. So they had enacted some stuff in 96 prior to 9/11. So these were broad legalistic approaches to trying to control emerging terrorist environments. So these approaches incorporated criminal justice and legal procedures to try to make investigation and prosecution of those involved in political violence easier. So we had the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in 1996. This was the first comprehensive counterterrorism legislation. It was passed after the terrorist attacks during the Atlanta Olympics and the Flight 800 disaster. It contained a lot of different provisions to regulate activity that could be used to mount a terrorist attack, provide resources for counterterrorism programs, and to punish terrorism. I'm not going to go into all the facets of all these different things because that would take forever, but make sure you know them, make sure you know what they did. All right, so the big one, after 9/11, we had the Patriot Act. Okay, this was passed in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. It's been controversial since the first day, right? And people still talk about it. It revised the standards of government surveillance, enhanced electronic surveillance authority, allowed roving wiretaps, required banks to identify sources of money, provided nationwide search warrants, deportation of immigrants who raise money for terrorist organizations, all kinds of different aspects of terrorism. It also included a sunset provision, which mandated that these major provisions expired after a certain length of time, if not reauthorized. So all these things that the Patriot Act did in the aftermath of 9/11, where everybody was kind of freaking out, like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? They put a sunset provision on there so that down the road they would have to be reauthorized. They would have to take a look at them again and think about, do we need these things? Are these things working? Um, are these things still important? Okay, Department of Homeland Security Act of 2002. It created the large cabinet level Department of Homeland Security, absorbed lots of agencies into it. It essentially created the third largest federal agency, just like that. All right, so in 2005, we had the USA Patriot Improvement and Reauthorization Act of 2005. So it renewed the original Patriot Act. It also added some new provisions. Okay, and since that time, reauthorization legislation was considered and signed in 2006, 2010, and 2011. All right, so in 2015, the Patriot Act was superseded by the USA Freedom Act of 2015. So the initial introduction of this act was in direct response to Edward Snowden publishing classified NSA memorandum. So when he did that, it revealed that the NSA engaged in bulk data collection of telecommunication records, and this was viewed as unacceptable surveillance of the private communications of everyday Americans. Like, this wasn't just people that they suspected of doing things, like, it collected everybody's stuff. So the Freedom Act then put strict limits on the ability for them to do this bulk collection of telephone records and internet data by these agencies. It also limited government data collection from certain geographic locations, certain service providers, but it did also still provide for roving wiretaps and other efforts to track possible lone wolves. All right, that's the end of Module 3. Be sure to do the reading. You'll learn all those different acts, the different conventions, know all those things that I didn't go into detail on the video, but make sure you know the aspects of those, what they did, what they authorized. Finish all your assignments for this week, and please let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you in the next module.